if assuming 12% dominance and roughly speaking this level of ETH supply, we can start making some projections on some different elements of where we think the total market cap goes. So in this case, you can do certain things like analyze some charts, use wonderful things like Elliott waves, Fibonacci extensions, and the like. I'm going to overly simplify, say, hey, for some very primitive Fibonacci extensions, these are some of the different ballpark values we can potentially land on. And so if this is the ETH dominance and this is roughly the total supply and the total market cap goes to this, then you can start to back end into, okay, this is where I think we're going to wind up with the overall ETH price. So again, we're really reliant upon more capital flowing into the market, and then how that might cascade and flow into other things. So along those lines, this is some of this information is a little bit out of date. I'm just going to quickly shrink this down a little bit so people can see some of the assumptions I've made here. Is I took a look at what do we know for certain sacrifice wallets and the like, where they have this number of ETH in it, then where do we think the ETH price winds up? Let's also make the assumption that certain aspects of liquidity are going to be redirected, which we've already started to see by way of ink emission manipulation and like an APRs changing on some of those PulseX pools. What percentage of benevolence do we think would be brought to the market? 50%. I don't think people are going to latch on, oh, when ETH hits this price, he's got $1 billion, or this wallet has $2 billion, or 11 quadrillion dollars, whatever the number ends up being. We need to make, for conversation's sake, some level of assumption that some of that might get deployed back into the market to prop up the price or drive the green candles, because Richard's in it for glory. So it's not going to be a 100% of that money gets deployed to the pool, because to your point, Max, people are looking for life-changing gains. I'm never going to fault somebody for positively changing their life as the opportunity arises. But my assumption here is roughly half of it would get deployed over time, because the other half needs to be kept in reserve to potentially continue to drive the charts, prop up the charts, or work through some other elements. So again, these numbers are slightly out of date for some of the calculations I've made here. My assumption was through sucking out 80% of the liquidity on this, then, and also having roughly at $6,000 ETH and a certain total market cap and blah, 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 then if I got $1 billion to work with, I'm going to take that 500 odd mil and do some assorted injections to buy up the price, stabilize the chart. Certainly there'll be some more friction, and shout out to Runeskis and some of his folks. We'll get to his calculator and his team's calculator in a few minutes. But I could sit there and say, okay, if I'm going to spend roughly, let's say 500 mil, then under those conditions, this is how I drive a 3.5 cent pulse. If I drive nearly 3.6 cent pulse under those conditions, then if I look at those ratios today and say, okay, if I'm going to wind up with like 3.6 cent pulse, what's the knock-on impact to PulseX, Inc, Hex, EHEX with some degree of reflexivity? Again, this is not a complete mathematical breakdown of every aspect of how PulseChain interoperates with each other and how different liquidity pools impact each other and arbitrage bots. We'll get to somebody's tool, again, shout out to Runeskis, where they've taken a lot of that extra information and layered it into it. So this is my back of envelope math I basically worked on months ago. And I was like, hey, this doesn't seem as crazy to me as people think. I look at a lot of this from an engineering perspective. If this is what you want, or this is the desired outcome, under what conditions does that start to become feasible or possible? And then you just start solving for the conditions. So I'm going to take a pause here on this one. I've thrown down some crazy moon math numbers. I know people are going to be salivating at that. I'm going to slightly rein those back in for a second. Questions on your side, Max? Anything here jumping out at you?
Yeah, just looking at, so the ETH, Are you thinking the ETH 6K instead of, I know a lot of people are calling for like 9K, 11K, 15K, like in that range too. Is this just more conservative estimate you're thinking?
Yeah, so I've got some reason to believe safely, because I don't want to, have completely salivating. And side note, if you are in a life-changing gains situation, I personally encourage viewers to take advantage of it. I wouldn't necessarily fully exit my positions. Hey, you do what's best for you and yours in the grand scheme of things. There's also a good chance you will not have the opportunity to have as much Pulse, PulseX, Inc, Hex as you do today. You may never get those bags back. So you have to make the decision that's best for you and yours. As far as my assumptions, I think 5 trillion-ish for the total market is a conservative estimate. I see Large wants me to make it bigger. So there you go, man. 5 trillion is my conservative estimate for total market cap. I think there's a pretty strong argument for 6 to 7 trillion. And then once we start talking 9, 10 trillion, to me, that's a little concerning for a different fashion. It probably means most governments around the world are just printing fiat currency like crazy. So I'd say somewhere between the realm of like 5 to 7 trillion is a probably safe bet. Again, though, this also depends on ETH dominance, because we've seen ETH dominance be north of 12%. So if more money this is a lot of the if this, then that type conversation. If more money comes flooding into the market, and all of a sudden we're at like a 16% type situation on there, then those numbers start to shift pretty significantly and pretty quickly. So there's a question of how much total money enters into crypto. Of the money that goes into crypto, how much of it winds up in ETH to drive the ETH price? And then there's a lot of assumptions that go into this in order to come up with some of these numbers, which in turn will start to drive some of those different price points. So that's a really long answer for, I don't know. I'm outlining a range of possibilities, right? Like it's the answer is not always a discrete number. Sometimes the answer is an algorithm. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking about the reserve piece. So what made you come up with, you said 50% reserve, you think of is that of the total benevolent whales or just of the SAC wallet?
Yeah, let me hop back over to that. That is not, let's say, total benevolent whales, like just a assumption on really the SAC wallet. So to your point, though, there are other whales splashing around in the ecosystem, or other whales who are interested in this space, and because they're looking for, some of them are looking for glory, some of them are looking to pump their own bag, some are looking for entertainment, any number of different motivations and factors on that. I figured, hey, 50% is kind of a safe bet. So again, a lot of assumptions here. One, they're going to have some level of benevolence, and they're going to share. They're in it for glory. 2, liquidity reduction and redirection. Maybe it's only 50%. Maybe it's 99%. Unknown. But this should start to give some of the viewers an idea of what is possible, not what is guaranteed. Also, I would be negligent in just me being me if I didn't sit here and say, just because you see the price on screen does not mean you're going to be able to cash out your entire bag at that level. So I encourage people to continue to be educated on things like liquidity pools, slippage, all those wonderful things. Just because you see the number on screen doesn't mean you're walking away with that number.
Yeah, definitely. I think, what was it, Hex at the peak? Remember Richard on stream doing like, oh yeah, you can sell with like, what was it, 2%, 1, 2, 3, 4% slippage. You could sell $1 million worth of Hex into stables around that time. So yeah, I mean, at this point, if we do get this massive glory run, do you think it'll be, of course, a lot of people will still be in FOMO mode, like, why would you sell now? We're just getting started. But the people who do want to take profits, do you think the liquidity will be, on PulseChain through stables with bridged in ETH or otherwise? You expect I guess the bridge numbers and the on ramps to have plenty of liquidity in order to cash out?
Yeah, it's I think a lot of it's going to depend on the bag, right? Because also too, I think some folks are going to want to leave certain funds on chain, and certain assets on chain, and not cash out back to fiat, because they're going to be folks that have like hundreds of millions, billions of a given token that they're unlikely to be able to get again in future cycles. So that's really the question there. I think we'll see certain things like maybe more loan-driven solutions on that. I think people are going to embrace single-sided pools to help with aspects of cashing out without smashing charts. And as far as total liquidity, I believe the total number will be ultimately higher for the chain than what the liquidity ultimately can support if everyone ran for the hills. So the kind of analogy would be somewhat of a bank run, which is why I think it's going to be important for people to have a system, a process, a set of rules where I'm going to stick to this and I'm going to take some off the table, take profits on the way up. Don't sit there like, I mean, you've seen it, I've seen it. Oh, it's only a 2x away, and then I get my round 1 million, 10 million, $100 million. I'm just going to sit there for the 2x. So you're going to round trip the whole thing. The people who did well last cycle are some of the people who, generally speaking, took profits along the way and secured some level of profitability on the way up. So to me, the math doesn't math out for everyone to exit out at like, a 15-cent PulseChain and all the related cascading impacts. It might be possible. I'd have to defer to folks more well-versed in cumulative and collective liquidity on chain. I just personally don't see it at this point in time, but that's just based on what I see today. as conditions change, so too do probabilities and outcomes.
15-cent PulseChain. Wow, that's music to my ears.
I think the numbers are crazier. And I know some of the conversations I've had with other folks, shout out Axis, he's potentially even far more bullish than I am. I just sit there and say, under what conditions does this become possible? Because then as a viewer, as a user of the chain, as an investor, as a builder, you can start to look for those conditions to be met. Hey, this means people are coming in. This means people are starting to rotate out. This means that, hey, we've got this bright, shiny, prime new opportunity. I'm getting in at the ground floor. So I always like to look at conditions.
And we'll wrap it up too. Just on the ratios and the numbers and the moon math part. Can you just give us a summary of what that looks like? Just some of that, maybe a couple highlights. What you get ink at? Wow, yeah. You want to just go through a couple and are we getting that $10 hex? What's going on?
Yeah. So I'll bring up one more calculator because, again, this is something I worked on months ago. And then I saw some other folks doing a way more updated and complete version of it where they really drilled into liquidity pools and started looking at slippage and the like. So this is my quick back of envelope math, and I'll somewhat bring people down to earth. I wanted to outline primarily the assumptions on how I started getting here. ETH dominance, supply, where does the total market cap go? That will really have a series of cascading impacts on that. As far as ratios today, it's really, I'll say simple. Based on today's prices and assuming these ratios hold true, if we get this set price in Pulse, then this is the related impact. So if we go to 3.6 cents Pulse, assuming those ratios hold true, and they won't, there'll be friction, there'll be arbitrage bots that'll clean up aspects of this, then these are the potential cascading impacts on that front. My personal plan is, as we start getting to each their own, you don't have to do anything I say. Hey, you're all capable of making your own decisions. I'm going to start taking some profits more significantly on the way up at a half-cent Pulse, 2-cent Pulse, and I'm not going to sit around and wait for some magic number to try to exit out. I think that's a tactical error because I know the size of my bags, and I know for a fact there are folks who have far bigger bags than I do. What does that mean potentially for them? I actually think it's an interesting double-edged sword in the sense that they potentially have the opportunity to start their profit-taking drip feed sooner than I do because they have more collective mass on that front. But it also means they can't take as much in one shot proportionately, potentially, because they would run the risk of slippage and shooting themselves in the foot by way of their own bag. So in certain respects, some of those liquidity constraints actually also somewhat function as kind of a whale trap for certain things. All right, let me quickly hop over and share this tab, and I'll throw the link in chat for your viewers over here. So in this case, Runeski's and his team, they built a more advanced price appreciation simulator. So you can start to look at, hey, this is what we have available for potentially a sort of liquidity deployment. So you can see PulseChain reserve based on ETH price and some other calculations. So, where's this all going? It's, pretty dynamic and elastic. So if they had 1.3 billion to deploy for conversation's sake, well, let's go with a more moderate number. Let's go with 6,000, which by their estimation for what they're tracking would give about $1 billion to deploy. They have a reason to believe that the optimal deployment would actually be into Hex and PulseX. And they do outline in their site some of how it works and what are the overall conditions and the like. So based on last 24 hours of pricing. So if I calculate that out based on their tools, then this is where they start to end up with Hex to $588, PulseX to 90 cents, right? Which to me looks a little wildly bullish on that. But having done some of the math out myself for my own, let's say spreadsheets and the like, I can see how that kind of works out. And that is, again, based on a long series of conditions. They do outline, hey, how this works. And you can go through and read the documentation yourself. They talk about the overall reflexivity, rotation of certain assets into other pools, rinse, repeat, arbitrage bots based on the math they have available. So that to me looks very optimistic on that front. You can also sit here and say, okay, what if it's an even split? And so I'm going to deploy 6,000 more uniformly to prop up different aspects of the ecosystem, or just into ink, or 34-cent Pulse, $280 Hex. And okay, again, I have to reiterate this. That is the price you see on screen. It does not necessarily mean you will be able to exit your bag out in full at that price. Even a wick counts, right? Because it's going to print that all-time high. Even a wick will print to that candle.
$280 hex. Oh man, that's
yeah. We're going to Applebee's after that one.
We're going. There may be an Applebee's, maybe an Outback Steakhouse, maybe
yeah,
maybe.
Maybe you're buying them, buying the chain.
Maybe there might be a few more conferences at that point. Once we get the hex strategic reserve, the White House.
Yes. So regardless, even if you think, hey, I think your math is very flawed, or it's bullshit, or I don't trust this tool, regardless, take a step back, and is it generally directionally correct? And I think there's overwhelming evidence to prove that through a combination of overall price appreciation, money flowing into the total market, as well as clever liquidity adjustments and manipulation, we can drive prices far higher than people thought were possible. We've outlined a set of conditions. When those conditions are met, these numbers become met. So just watch the conditions, and that'll let you know what's coming.